Good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting a couple minutes until we get other people joining us, and we'll start shortly. Okay, we're going to get started here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us. We're excited about today's webinar because it's the result of many years of work. RTS is in its 9th year, and we've evolved a lot of our work working with brands. We work with a lot of emerging brands and legacy brands through a very disruptive time. As you know, the industry is changing dramatically. Everyone's talking about fast casual, but the bulk of the business is still sit-down restaurants and QSR. And along the way, we've really spent a lot of time developing processes and learning some things that we think have been somewhat revolutionary, because in today's world, the big question for a brand is how do we differentiate the brand? How do we create an experience for guests that is memorable and brings them back? And the ironic thing is it really comes down to what happens within the four walls. You know, we meet with companies that spend tens of millions of dollars in advertising, and sales are negative. And when I ask them, well, why are you still advertising? It's because they're scared to death that if they didn't, sales would drop even more. And they'll spend a lot of money on advertising that's not working or is not effective, and they'll spend very little money where we think it matters the most. So that's what the point of the seminar is today, is to really help you understand how this can come about. How do you create an experience for guests that is memorable and brings them back? And recognizing that a big part of it, you'll hear a lot about this today, is the actual anticipation of what's about to occur is probably more important than the actual reality of it. And as we go through this webinar, you'll see some tips of the trade of how this will work. Let me introduce our panelists for today. Joining me today is Laura Martin, who's been with us for many, many years, and she focused a lot on brand strategy and experience. And I'd say along with me has really developed a lot of the process that you're going to be going through today. Len Galani, former Chief Operating Officer for Buca di Beppo in the good old days, has got a lot of experience in concept execution and operational excellence, and works with companies to really help them engage their employees to deliver a really great guest experience. So I think our big starting point, and this to us is really probably one of the things that we want you to keep in the forefront of your mind. This is a quote from Brene Brown, who's a sort of an anthropologist, a social anthropologist. And her statement is that people are not rational beings with occasional emotion. They're emotional beings with occasional rational thought. When we start talking about the experience today, we're going to talk a lot about emotions. And if you start with the premise that people fundamentally are emotional, not logical, it'll completely change the way you see them, interact with them. This includes your employees. And by the way, think about it for yourself. Some of you on the phone I know are very accomplished, and you might consider yourselves a very logical person. I'm sure you are. But the fundamental base of who you are, who all of us are, is that we are emotional, first and foremost. And logic can intercede with the impulses we may feel. And this is the foundation of how we design our guest journey. So what we've looked at is a lot of buzz about loyalty programs. We see a lot of apps and things people are using as marketing has moved to digital. And everyone's trying to come up with a loyalty program. And in our experience, most loyalty programs are really transactional. In fact, if anything, they're more frequency programs. They're not really loyalty programs. If you look at couponing and discounting, it's like a one-night stand. It's sort of like, we're not worth what we charge, so we're going to give you a bribe to come in. You move to sort of frequency in the middle, and that's where you buy 9, get the 10th free. And then loyalty, true loyalty on the far right, is a deep nurturing relationship where people are rewarded for having already spent their money. And so our big thing is, how do we look at this guest journey? And to make sure that if you want to have loyalty, forget the program, loyalty is earned by the experience that the guest has. And so we look at the brand first and foremost. What is it that you stand for? Why do you exist? We're going to talk about brand purpose quite a bit in this webinar. And then, as we already described, we'll explain it to you, the emotion of it, and then the concept execution. When a brand is truly differentiated, it's not operations, it's concept execution. And experience, which is what people talk about, restaurants sell an experience, is, if you think about it, what is an experience? It's really activity tied to emotion, expressed that way. And this is a lot of what we're going to be talking about, teaching you how you can try and do that. So let me start off by having Laura make some comments on this, and then we'll get into the meat of it.
Great. Thanks, Fred. Really what we're trying to get at, to get beyond loyalty programs, we're trying to find the value that's out there beyond the repeat purchase. We're really looking at, not just frequency, how do we just get them in faster, how do we get them to spend more? It's like, how do we build that really, really deep value and resonate with people and build that relationship so that we can make the brand sustainable and the brand begins to sustain itself without as much care and feeding. And that's really where the guest journey piece of what we do came in.
So, Laura, let's talk a little bit about, since you've been my partner in crime on developing some of this stuff, how did we come up with it?
Well, it's interesting. We're a group of folks, when we come together, we're really intellectually curious, and we spent a lot of time looking at other industries. We look outside hospitality, we look a lot at retail, we look a lot at what's going on in other service industries and in different spaces out there. And there's a lot out there right now around customer journey mapping. So as we started to dig deeper into that, we really started to say, how do we apply this to hospitality? And that's where we started kind of shifting the model and bringing some other layers into it that are important in the hospitality. The other piece is, you hear so much about engagement. We have to engage. We have to engage with the employees. We have to engage with the guests. Well, how do you teach, 50 staff members across 700 locations how to engage? And we have to build an emotional connection. You probably hear that coming a lot from your marketing group. Of what we're trying to do with advertising to build emotional connections. And we've started to dissect that, so what is the science behind it? So we're really looking at those two pieces to break them down, and then we also want to look at that customer journey mapping that's used in other industries, and what we're going to show you is how we layer all of those pieces together to really come up with a fantastic design for hospitality.
Yeah, that's great, Laura. That reminds me of, we would sit there and brainstorm and try and visualize what would the guests go through as they come into a restaurant, and we started really noticing that there were some things that were in common as we experienced restaurants. We said, wow, that was a fantastic experience, and what made it so? And it was that emotional response that an employee sort of got out of us as a result of the interaction.
You're exactly right, Fred, and that's what, how we're moving to that sustainability, there are three big components to it. It's the execution itself, so it's what's going on in the operation, and we all know that, stellar operations now is the price of entry. I mean, that's what you need to do just to be able to survive. So what is that additional edge that you can get that's really going to move you forward? And then we start with the execution. We're going to layer sensory into it. We're going to lay emotion to it. And then we're going to show you how we weave that across the entire end-to-end journey so that we can deliver that quality of the operation and that certainty, but more importantly, get the emotional outcome and the connection that we need with the guests. So the guest journey, what it really is, it's an evolution in thinking beyond, moment of truth and touch point approaches that we've all become accustomed to, and that we all try to create these magic moments at somewhere during the experience and those kinds of things. And this really is taking all that good thinking and great work and moving just a little further on. It's really anchored in how the guests think about it. So you look back at, for example, mystery shop, a lot of those things, did somebody put a bed nap down is what we're measuring. So who that signals they were greeted, a drink order was taken, et cetera. Guests didn't give, a darn about any of that stuff. So we're really taking it and looking at it from the guest lens and from their needs, and then the kind of experience they have as they go through the interaction with the brand. And then we're looking at all those events that really mark the defining experience, that create those memories, that pay off that anticipation. And then it's also, there's another component to it, it's multi-touch and it's also multi-channel, because if you look at it, people interact with your brand in a lot of different ways. They may be interacting with the brand going through a drive-through. That's one journey. They may be doing it as curbside takeout. That's another journey. It may be a full-blown fine dining experience, and that's an entirely different journey. So there are a lot of different channels that guests can have journeys within, but it's multi-touch because there's not one person that's really responsible for that end-to-end journey. There are a lot of cast of characters, a lot of people, and a lot of behaviors that need to come together, from a staff level to be able to create that entire journey.
Yeah, and Laura, you're right, and therein lies the rub. Especially for restaurants that are chain restaurants where they've got a lot of outlets, and they do their best with training programs, but then they're not really sure, well, how do we get the employees to do this? But maybe, Len, you can share with us, why is that end-to-end experience so challenging?
Well, Fred, the first thing that Laura said, or the last thing that Laura said, was there's more people involved in the end-to-end journey. And because there's more than one person involved, each one is working in a departmentalized silo. So they're hardwired to deliver at those touch points. The guest-facing staff, those people within each touch points, don't necessarily know what happened before them or what's about to happen to them after them. Consider the guest that walks into the door and a hostess seats them at a table at a closed station. After a period of time, the manager may either relocate that guest to another station. By the time they get to their final server, that final server has no idea what happened previous to them. And you just only hope that the handoff to the next stage of their journey is positive. Because we operate that way, the metrics are touch point based as well. Consider the typical mystery shopper report. I don't know about you guys, but when you look at a mystery shopper report, it's almost all mechanical based. Was your drink delivered in 5 minutes? Did your food come within 12 to 15 minutes? I've never seen a mystery shopper report that actually asked the question, how did you feel when you went from point to point? How did you feel when you received your drink? And our performance data in most of these operations is based on the success of each one of those silos as opposed to the total performance across the journeys.
No, it's a great point. It reminds me, I think one of the most revolutionary things for me is when we discovered this great book by Simon Sinek, Start With Why. I wrote it several years ago, and Laura's going to explain about it in a second. But when we worked with brands, all of them had ad agencies or had a unique selling proposition, but there was something missing. It just didn't quite feel right. It didn't resonate correctly. And when I remember reading this book and sharing it with the rest of you, and this really answered that question for us, because it helped us see things from the inside out rather than the outside in, and it changed the whole way we work with people. And this was the starting point of the guest journey, is understanding fundamentally why does a brand exist. So Laura, maybe you can comment on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, Simon Sinek, he has what he calls the golden circle. It's sort of the premise of things, and it's really, as Fred said, that inside out. So it's starting with why, and why is the center. It's, why do you do what you do, and what's the purpose? Then you're getting into how you do, and then you're getting into what you do. And it's really, you get into the psychology of how people buy, if you think about it. And that's where the people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. Apple's a great example with this. If Apple came out and said, we've got this really good gadget, and this is how we produce it, do you want to buy one? Most people would say no. But instead what they do, they come out and they say, think differently. It's like everything we do, we challenge the status quo, which is how they come up with iPods and things that people have never even conceived of. They create those. So they're really coming at you as a consumer with the why. Then they're telling you how they're made. Oh, by the way, it's really sleek designs, etc. Then they can tell you some of the functionality. And then do you want to buy one? You really do.
Well, that's great. That's a good explanation. Now, Simon does spend a little bit of time talking about biology, so we don't want to get too technical with you, but it's an important consideration. And I do want to remind all the attendees, if you have a question of us at any point throughout the webinar, feel free to insert a comment in the chat box, and we'll get to your question as is appropriate. So, Laura, put on your brain surgeon hat and talk to us a little bit about how this works.
Yeah, I know if you're an operator in the audience, you're really thinking, is this the time that I tune out? But this actually gets to the scalability of things and talking about, how do we create training programs that really engage employees and the kinds of things that we do. And there's a ton of psychology to it, and then there's a lot of, really primitive aspects to it as well. So, why do we need to connect to emotion? Emotion is important because decision making is made in the reptilian brain, the old brain. Some people call it the lizard brain. And that's really deep down in there. And decision making is made there, but there's no rational thinking. There's no language associated with that area of the brain. So we can create all the marketing messages we want. We can create all the, rational steps of service that we want. You're not getting to people on their gut where they really make decisions. And the only way to get to that limbic brain is through the emotional brain itself, which is the limbic brain. So that's where emotions become critically important in addition to all those steps of service and the operations excellence that we design to be able to get to people at that gut level.
That's great. I remember when I first brought this up to you, Len, you thought I had 3 heads on my shoulders here. So, as an operator, when you start hearing stuff like this, how does that change, or what did it do for you to get an understanding of what this is all about?
That's funny, Fred, because as an operator and coming through decades of working in operations, when I first read the book and I first looked at this diagram, I scratched my head and I said, this is crazy. Operators aren't going to understand that. How can I explain this? And when I finally understood the one statement that Laura mentioned earlier, it just doesn't feel right. When somebody would ask me, well, why do you think the way you're thinking, and what makes you say that? And I would explain it, well, you know what, I can't really explain it, I just know that that's the way I feel. So that made a lot of sense to me at that point.
That's great. So Laura, let's walk through sort of how we see this get down more to, we're starting at 30,000 feet, now we're getting back down to some specifics. And working through all of it. So we know that we got our lizard brain there. Not that anyone here is a lounge lizard, but we know how this works. But let's get into the specifics of how we can start, building this design.
Well, great. It's really to get to a sustainable brand. If you think about what's going out there, the model right now in the industry that we've always used, there's so many great operators that develop fantastic concepts, but as we begin a new concept, or if we're trying to re-engineer an older concept, a lot of it starts with financial targets, and we're looking at the box economics that need to work, and then we're looking at what are the operating standards so that we can really put out a great product for customers. The operations side of it and the customer experience actually becomes more of a byproduct. And if it go back to the Simon Sinek model, we're telling people what we do. We're saying, here's the box economics that work for us. Here's the experience we're going to deliver to you. It's our what. And it's just not as compelling. And what we've really started to have is the reversal that's been game-changing, and some of the work we do at RTS is looking at the model from a different perspective, from that purpose. So you're really starting with that why, the core element, and you've got the entire organization wired around that. Then you've also got the employee journey, which becomes absolutely the most critical aspect of it, because it's your employees, it's the frontline people. If you're in a turnaround situation, or if you're in a new, fresh emerging brand, those are the people that are going to lead the guest journey, and they're going to lead the organization, because they're the ones actually delivering that experience. But then when you get to the guest journey, we really design it. So we're looking at what is that optimal guest experience that's really desired, and how do we design that and map it out with all the different layers of operating mechanics, the components, but then also the psychological aspects that come into it, and the sensory. So we layer all those pieces together, and that's what we're going to show you is how we actually do that. Then the outcome of it are fantastic financials. And there are a lot of folks doing this out there in other industries that are just getting great returns and great results with it. And we started to work in the hospitality industry, and we're seeing very similar results.
Now, Laura, I think what comes to mind here is that there's all this talk about fast casual brands, and I'm going to suggest that it has nothing to do with the format of the service as much as the intent of the concept. The difference with fast casual brands is they probably have much more of an understanding of why they exist, and they engage their employees very well, and they're not looking at the bottom line first. When we work with some older brands, you get in there, they start talking about how their food costs are too high or labor's too high, and how do we cut that back. They're not talking about the things that are going to make a difference. And we've sort of discovered along the way that if you just create better value for your guests, they'll come back more often. And if they do, guess what? Sales go up and profits go up. As dumb as that may sound, sometimes it's a very different mindset for people. And I'd love to have you comment more about how we actually sort of design this concept execution into the brand.
Yeah, that's a great point, Fred. And, you're right. Regardless of what kind of concept you are, it's really, so much has gone on with training programs and steps of service that we almost stand back from it. It becomes militaristic, and we sort of dehumanize the experience sometimes. You look at, Chick-fil-A is a fantastic example in QSR of kind, caring people that connect with their guests in a very, very different way. 11 Madison Park, on the really high end of it in New York, they have a role called the Dreamweaver, and that's their responsibility, is to sort of surprise and delight and, make miracles happen within the restaurant. So two very broad ends of the spectrum. But what's important, what we do is the design really has to happen from the ground up, and it's got to start, essentially with the fundamental guest needs. And as you're designing it, you're working in ways, intentionally within the guest journey map that you map out of how you're building those relationships and cultivating that deep attachment. And that's what's really moving us to that sustainability, that's that value beyond repeat purchase. Then the execution side of it, once we have that, then we start to layer in how we execute on that. So, within the training, we're starting with values. We're getting employees to understand what the emotional outcome is. No one's training the Dreamweaver at 11 Madison Park that these are the specific things you need to do. They're saying, this is how we want guests to feel. There's a great example in an article that we came across about that Dreamweaver. People were talking about they'd had the ultimate New York experience, and dining at 11 Madison Park, was of course one of the absolute highlights. So they said, the one thing we didn't do was eat a New York slice of pizza. This guy got in a cab, went and came back, and they actually served that to him in the restaurant, a real, street piece of pizza from New York. And that was the memory that was created. It had nothing to do with the food they specifically ate. It was just that absolute moment that you really can't train. But what that person does know is this is the emotional outcome I need to create and the memories that are significant with every guest.
That's great. So let's get down to the building blocks of what creates the guest journey. Then we'll show you how we put it all together. So Len, why don't you just walk through the sensory experience piece?
Well, what you see here are the 5 senses. And these are things that we learned in grade school, and we tend to take them for granted. Martin Lindstrom, who is a branding expert in consulting, a consultant of neuromarketing, wrote this great book called Brand Sense, and he reminds us of some things that really play a role in everything that we do. Recognizing that anybody who walks into your establishment, whether you are aware of it or they're aware of it, they experience everything and they remember everything and they feel everything through their senses. What are they smelling, seeing, touching, tasting, and hearing? And the organization by nature will affect their experience. Let's take a look at what that looks like in an actual operation. What you see here is a pentagon that represents those 5 senses. In the center of that pentagon is a 0%, meaning that nothing is being experienced through the senses. Well, we know that that's virtually impossible. The outside edge is 100%, almost an assault to your senses, where everything is influencing your behavior, your thoughts, your feelings through your senses. If you take a look at a typical or an example of an existing operation, in the center you see that green platform. What that tells us is that sight is a very predominant sensory element that's being appealed to in our guest, but sound is not so much, and neither is taste. That could be an example of you walk into an operation, you walk into the restaurant lobby, and you see this beautifully decorated location, nice clean carpeting, clean edges, but it's quiet. It almost feels like a funeral home. You're not hearing anything. You're not hearing energy. And you also see that the taste profile there is relatively low on the scale. That could be an example that the food looks great but doesn't taste quite as good as it looks. The idea is to push these elements out to a point where you're actually influencing the guest feelings through emotions you're creating through those sensory elements by design. Maybe that means improving your flavor profile. Maybe it means enhancing smells that you want them to experience and reducing smells that you don't, like a dirty mop bucket or a wet rotted bar. You're improving your sound system when the music quality and the value makes more sense to them. And overall, it gives you a better experience.
Well, I think this reminds me a little bit about the concept of delicious. Everyone talks about serving delicious food and having happy guests and happy engaged employees. But when you start asking the specifics of it, they can't ever tell you. And so I always ask people, boy, if everyone's had delicious food, can I order 100 cases of delicious from my distributor? And of course, the answer is you can't, because it's a dumb question. But what is delicious as an intangible experience? The sensogram tells you what it is. It's how food looks, how it smells, how it tastes, and how it feels when you bite into it. Those four senses in balance will create this intangible experience called delicious. Likewise, if you want guests to feel special and cared for, it's what they see, hear, and feel as they walk in the front door and are greeted by a hostess in a proper way. So that's how we start building the guest journey, is to use these senses to do that. And the other layer of it, of course, is emotions. And Laura, talk to us a little bit about how emotions play into this now.
Sure. Well, I hope the emotional outcome, that no one's getting bored at this point, but, one last comment on emotions, and then we're really going to move into how we actually start doing some of the mapping. But you hear so much about emotional connection, and as a marketer and a branding person and, decades in the industry, it just started to drive me insane trying to answer that question. So I really started to look into the science of emotion more. And what we discovered there is some great work by Plutchik, The Wheel of Emotions. And what this is really about is emotions have levels of intensity and emotions grow. So what may start as serenity up there in the yellow can grow into joy and to ecstasy. Where you have annoyance over in the red, that can grow into anger, that can go a lot further into rage. But the real fascinating part is what emotions have to be combined to create what you're seeing in the white petals of the diagram. And if you want to get to, say, if we start with that anticipation that was so important of designing happiness, we start with that interest and anticipation. They have a great experience. You combine it with serenity, joy, or even ecstasy, you've got huge optimism. You move that around and you continue to create experiences like that. In the green, you're building acceptance and trust and admiration because you're doing it consistently, visit after visit with that engagement. That's how you're truly getting love for a brand. So there's actually some science to emotion, but what's really important about this is once we have this understanding, we can design it very, very differently. One last example on that is you can take that interest and anticipation and say a first-time guest, and they have a negative experience over there in the red, and the annoyance and the anger and the rage. You put those two together and you get aggressiveness. And you think about what happens when people go in with high anticipation for a restaurant or even moderate expectations for a restaurant and have a bad experience, they go out on Yelp and they really get aggressive about it. And some of them actually get hostile. So once you start realizing how they all work together, it's so eye-opening that you really start to understand this is how we scale emotional connection.
So we've had a couple of questions regarding the employee journey piece, employee engagement. We're going to get into that next as we start helping you understand how that path looks. So what's that journey look like? Here begins the map. And Len will start getting into a little bit about how this works, and we're going to build on this layer so you begin to understand how this works as it relates to your guests and employees. Go ahead, Len.
Well, the interesting thing here is this is a relationship between where companies spend their resources relative to what's really important to the guest. I mean, think about the typical situation where a company spends quite a bit of money in marketing to get people in the door, to drive trial. And they also spend quite a bit of money in marketing to bring them back and to keep the brand awareness high. What's really important for the guest is what happens in between. What happens between the time they pull into your parking lot and the time they leave. And we see that companies don't really spend enough resources there, whether it's money, efforts, training, to meet that gap. The important thing, or the interesting thing is, and it's actually the good news, is if companies would spend more money on that guest journey in between the time that they come in and the time that they leave, not only would we create an overall positive experience, but it's also cheaper. And we've all heard that line that it's cheaper to keep an existing guest than it is to try to win back a bad one. So how do we, as we begin to map that journey, how do we start? And we're thinking we want to start through the guest standpoint. If the outcome is an emotional outcome that keeps the guest, or that gets into that limbic brain and makes them decide quickly, that it makes them feel that they need to be back, we need to look at it through their lens, anticipating their needs, recognizing the potential highs and lows and the emotional highs and lows throughout their experience. What are they thinking and feeling? Recognizing the moments of anxiety and frustration and correcting that immediately. Once we understand how we want them to feel throughout that experience. Then we put on our operator's hat and say, okay, how do we deliver that? Now let's look at the front of the house and back of the house systems. Let's look at our hiring profile and our training and development of our staff, and put the skills in place, the mechanics, and measure the right things so that we do gain that emotional outcome.
So let's look at what we typically see as what we call an unconscious guest journey. And this is one where it just is just not going well. This is the disinterested host, the server who's a little bit late to the table and is not really thinking about the emotional outcomes. They may be going through the paces that they got in the training program, but they're missing some key things. Go ahead, Len.
Here's a typical operation. Here's a typical, not a typical, hopefully, they're not all that bad, but here's an example of one that happens without intent. If you look at the solid blue line, the horizontal solid blue line in the middle, it separates positive experiences from negative experiences. So imagine you and your guest are pulling into the parking lot. You recognize that the parking lot is clean, great. It either resonates with you or it doesn't, but it doesn't have a positive or negative emotion. As you're looking for a parking spot, you notice that there's plenty of light bulbs out in the parking lot. You may have to dodge around some potholes before you find your spot. You find your spot and you walk into the front desk. You walk into the front lobby, only to find that there's nobody there. You see a host desk, a host stand, or a podium, but there's nobody around. You wait, and luckily for you, a server walks through the dining room and greets you. So that's a little positive experience at that point, but you know, it's just not quite, it's something you expected in the first place, so you're not feeling that positive, but you at least know that you've been acknowledged. You're brought to your table, you sit down, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and there's a long wait for that server. By the time the server gets there, luckily they take their drink order, and you happen to get your drinks fast and cold, and they're delicious, and you're feeling a little better about things. You've already ordered your food, and now you're waiting for your food. Again, a wait, and the food comes a lot later than you expected, and it's not right. It's cold. It's kind of lifeless. One of you goes to the bathroom, to the restroom, and it's clean. Okay, you expected that, but you're still not feeling extra great because of your previous experience. Because your food is not right, you'd like to tell someone. Well, the server never makes a check back, never comes back to the table, never touches you. Finally, a manager comes to the table. Maybe this is too little, too late. If the manager comes to the table, you tell him about your experience, and he offers you a free dessert. Okay, great. Now you're sitting there after your meal, and the server just seemed to have gone home. You have an unbearably long wait for your check. By the time you get the check is processed just fine. The host says goodbye on your way out, but you don't feel one way or the other. The experience was an experience. You may have satisfied your biological need for nourishment, but what are you thinking? Now let's layer on what happens from the guest standpoint.
So Laura, why don't you go ahead and take us through this then?
Sure. Well, this is actually, we're looking at the sensory piece. Because remember, as we're designing the journey, this is an unconscious journey, but we're really designing the journey. We want to understand how are we engaging the senses, and those senses are what are leading us to emotions, which is getting us to the good old-fashioned lizard brain. So the science behind it, and to get those touch points and brand pieces, you want to have more than one sense. So we start a little bit low as you're coming in the entrance. You can move up to 4 through the greeting. You can actually have up to 5 senses during the dining experience, and this is really the longest part of the engagement, and you have all 5 senses. Then you're moving into payment and departure, it drops down again. Well, what's interesting is we challenge clients to figure out how do you bring the sensory level back up in the ending, because the ending is so important, because the ending is directly tied to memories, and memories are an absolute part of the anticipation, and it's the memory of the event are the two that are far more important, believe it or not, than the event itself. So we just challenge guests to try to bring that up a level. There's a study out there with waiters. A waiter that brings mints with a check gets a 3% higher tip. A waiter that actually says, hey, does anybody want some mints? They get a 14% higher tip. So, just that last bite of chocolate or whatever it may be, you can engage in senses on a higher level. The next thing we do is we go in and we look at the emotion on it. And in this sort of unconscious guest journey, if we look at what's happening, we've got some positive elements that happen, but we started out feeling unsafe. Then we feel anxious. And then we're moving along. So as we go through it, we've got quite a few positives, but we also have a lot of negative. So if we look at the real trajectory of that over time, we're going to map, all those emotional highs and lows. What is the net effect? Next slide, please. So the net effect, as we map those out, we're really looking at what happens. So we're looking at what happens with the net effect there. So we've got the green up top, so we did have some positive elements, but primarily it was a negative experience that can continue to grow as negativity, and then the ending and the memory really was the clincher.
And so we have here now is moving into a design guest journey where everything is positive and what the outcomes are there. And so in this case, you see that everything's above the line that Len mentioned, and we're talking about, operations with intention, something that's clearly designed. The employees are engaged, understand this. And when people talk about the employees, and like I said, the employee journey is a whole separate webinar unto itself, but we're going to show you momentarily how you can create a guest experience that has this be your final outcome as much as possible. So Laura, if you can just sort of tie in how that works.
Yeah, it just ties us back to, we're starting with an anticipation. That's such an important part. We're trying to end, on a positive note and create that memory, but we've got to look at the layers of emotions and how they're actually working together so that we're designing with that emotional outcome in mind.
Good. So now here's the typical experience is everything's going well, but all of a sudden you don't get your check at the end. So Len, just walk us through what happens when you blow it. Everything was going great and bam.
Well, imagine that positive model when the guest was experiencing all of the emotions through their sensory elements, and they're all at play, right? As they go on, they anticipate the next stage, and they're feeling great, and they're feeling excited, and they're experiencing, wow, this is really great. Everything that's happening to us is just fine. We get to the food, it's delicious, and now we're waiting again for that long payment process. So what we've seen is that that anticipation that has built throughout the experience now merges with anger. They're sitting there for a long time. It's a half an hour. They haven't seen their check. They haven't seen their server. That anger almost becomes, if it doesn't become, aggressiveness. And at this point, what happens? You may not hear from the guest, but you may read about it in Yelp. But contrarily, if you start with a bad experience and you build it all the way to a very positive, you have a greater chance of resolving that problem and saving the guest. But it usually does not work well for you if you end on a negative note.
So let's get into the actual, building your own map, and especially how does it include your employees?
What we look at, Fred, on the design of the guest journey, this is sort of a basic template to walk you through how you're going to design the journey. So we're looking at everything of how they're attracted to the brand, so even the messaging, advertising, what they're seeing on social media before they even get in the door. And we're carrying the whole journey out through the exit and then the extension beyond the exit, which could be social media. But as we design the journey, there are some layers to it, but the entire piece starts around what is that emotional outcome? How do you want people to feel? Do you want them to feel welcomed and loved? Do you want them to feel that they're getting, some distinct curated experience? Or do you want to attract guests who believe what you believe? All of those things are really key. So we start with that why, and then we're looking at it through the guest eyes when you come in, what's the physical evidence? What am I actually seeing? Disney talks about when they design happiness. Disney, Soul Cycle, they all create a portal that you literally walk through. With Disney, you go through kind of a dark tunnel, and you're leaving the outside world behind. And then when you emerge from that tunnel, you're literally moving into a different world. You've got, the smell of fudge. You have a lot of sensory elements that are going on, and you're seeing happy characters, and you're seeing, plants and trees and water, and you're feeling safe with all the nature. So that's very, very designed with a lot of intention. So then we layer in the sensory at what's happening at each stage. And then really important, we're looking at what are the front of the house and what are the back of house employee actions that need to make each of these steps really come to life and build advocacy for the gaps or the fail points that we see. Then we're layering in what kind of systems and support processes are important. What's fascinating about this is then once you've got your journey, you have it mapped out with sensory and emotion, and then how all the experience you want the guest to actually enjoy to pay off your brand, then you go in and build in your training program. So you're designing training programs with this in mind, and then you're building in your metrics, your KPIs, your incentives, your bonuses, so you're really incentivizing the right kind of behaviors. And this gets into, say, back to the example of that Dreamweaver at 11 Madison Park, what they're trying to accomplish is very, very different than, say if you train a host and say, we want you to greet everybody in X amount of times, this is what we want you to do. Those are all mechanics of how to greet and how to speak. But if you actually told the host, we want everybody that comes in to immediately feel welcome and warm and loved, and you really go to that lizard brain and the emotional connection, not only does the employee get it because you've involved them in it instead of telling them mechanics, but they produce the outcome that you're looking for.
So on this next slide is a bit of an eye chart, so that when you look at it, don't try and read it. Essentially what this basically does is to focus on what happens once we build this guest journey. And this gives you an example of what it looks like as we say, what do we want people to have as an emotional outcome? What's the physical staging? What's the part that the customer has to perform? Where do the employees fit in there? What are the support processes? From here, and this is answer the question for those of you who asked about the employee engagement. We take company's current training program and basically lay it underneath this to say, what are you actually training people to do now? And in our experience, we've discovered a 50 or 60% gap from the outcome you want to the one you're getting, because what you'll find is most of the time, people are being trained in the mechanics of service, not in the warm, engaging hospitality, because we're not showing people how to create an emotional reaction in people. We're merely making sure they take the drink order, the food order correctly, the food's heat hot, and all that, which is very important. We don't want to say that that's not important, but it's not enough if you really believe that people want to have an experience that is really fed on in terms of anticipation. And this is what we do for people, is to take it from here, look at the training program, and then recreate the training program with this in mind. I think there's certain brands out there who do a phenomenal job of this. One of them that comes to mind is Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A, those are the happiest employees you've ever seen. They're always smiling. They're always saying, it's my pleasure. They always have a twinkle in their eye. And they're sincerely, genuinely happy to see you because they understand a key word of empathy. And that's what people do. So once you map out this entire guest journey and you redo your training program, the key thing to understand as we've gone from the bottom up is that it changes the organization. And Len, maybe you could just share with the group here, how does it change your organization? What happens to them?
Well, I think if you remember why things don't work early on in the presentation, what we see mainly in the organization, what changes more than anything else before we get to the individual details is the entire culture changes. And the not-so-secret weapon is how do you handle that through your employees? To tag on what Fred was just talking about, the employee experience, we talk about the guest journey, but let's also consider the employee's journey and how that influences the guest journey. Benjamin Franklin had one of my favorite quotes, and it's, "Tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I might remember. Involve me and I'll understand." If we involve our employees, if we involve our staff, beginning with the frontline management, all the way through every single employee, and they understand the why of what we're doing and they understand the emotional outcome, things change. The voice of the guest, as you see at the top of this chart, the voice of the guest becomes paramount. The organization implements feedback systems to understand the guest view, the emotions, the connection, their intent to return, rather than measuring specific mechanics. You build process efficiencies by simplifying the end-to-end experience process and opening the door to improvements. Remember, we talked about the silos and the individual silos, that they become almost one person. Everybody who still touches that experience becomes almost one person because they're all focused on the same thing, the emotional outcome of the guest. The performance management systems will also change to gauge the right key performance indicators, not necessarily the details of every single silo. You forget the silos, you forget the touch points, and you concentrate on the emotional outcomes. That helps you organize the team that you have by hiring the right people, training them and developing them. So the entire mindset changes. The entire staff culture recognizes the results of the emotional experience, the why, as opposed to the mechanical monotony of what and how.
That's great. So, essentially what, companies that really get this, really understand, everyone along the way from the support center down to the store level, understand what they're there, what the value is that they're delivering people. And they know what matters and why it matters. That's why brand purpose is so important. We engage with companies, the first 2 days are spent going through the brand, understanding why they exist and the purpose and how it resonates to employees as well as all stakeholders as well as guests. And then as we get into the journey of continuous innovation is not just new menu items. Innovation is new things you can do to surprise and delight guests, because it is about anticipation. And then the culture is paramount here, because a company has to not just be smart, it has to be healthy. And this is what the employee journey is. We're going to have a separate webinar, the employee journey. How do we just go through that map, and now how do we create those training programs? And then making sure that these processes support consistency of the operation so that it's not having to reinvent the wheel all the time. And Laura mentioned it earlier, we're big on employee incentives. We do a lot of things to engage the employees. I know there's a lot of controversy in the industry right now about Fight for 15. And I think both sides of the conversation are mistaken. They need to listen to it. Do employees need to have some form of living wage? Well, of course they do. How can you deny that? At the same time, you just can't grant them a wage that makes the restaurant go bankrupt, because the margins in this business have become more and more compressed. What we have found is that by really having a conscious design guest journey, it's the best opportunity you have to build sales inexpensively, because it's done as the result of the guest experience. And that guest experience creates a desire to return. I can't wait to come back because I just had a great time, and Susie was fantastic. She made me feel special. I want to come back again. And this is what we're trying to accomplish, to help you understand that you can actually consciously design this process to make sure that you have a much better guest experience without the hit-and-miss tactics that go on now. And for those of you who have big advertising budgets, cut the budget on advertising, put it into the guest experience through some of the methodology we're talking about here, and you'll find you'll have a much more successful operation, and more importantly, a distinctive brand that is an emotional connection to your guests that they will respect and provide great loyalty to and come back. So I want to thank everyone for their time today, and also encourage you to ask more questions. We've been looking at the chat meter as well, and let you know that we are going to be having another webinar on April 28th to unravel the tech maze. It's with some of our technology and systems people to help you do that. But if you do have more questions, we'll look for your questions and try and answer them. You can direct them to anyone in particular here as well. So one of the questions that came in is about having a webinar on the guest journey, which we will do. And essentially, as I already described, it will involve much more of the training programs that we develop as part of this. This also, just so you understand from the guest journey standpoint, this includes how do you attract, recruit, onboard, train, engage, develop people from womb to tomb. So it's not just sort of a flavor of the month. This really impacts your culture very deeply.
Yeah, Fred, if I can add to that, I mean, I think, the goal is really to hire hard and manage easy. So you want to attract the right employees, and that's where a lot of that, the value and the purpose comes into it. There are some great concepts out there that are doing fantastic work around the employee journey, and they literally have, at the beginning, before you fill out an application, it's 5 or 6 questions that, and they say at the top, when you sit down and fill it out, and they say, if, these questions, this is who we are, this is how we operate, if these questions are uncomfortable with you, you may be in the wrong place. They start that before they even start the application process with people. Another thing on the employee journey that's been fascinating, we've seen clients that have very, very high standards for their employees and their training, and they'll take us through, for example, their uniforms, their uniform policy, how the uniform has to be, what length of hair has to be pulled back, the policy on tattoos and piercings and what level are available, all these kinds of things, because they want their people to look spectacular. We go through and we actually go through the employee journey, including the hiring and the onboarding process. But when this employee shows up to work and they go to clock in, there's the bathroom that's there for them is absolutely filthy. There's not even a doorknob on it. You know, I mean, you know how the back of the house can get sometimes. You know, nobody wants to admit it, but they can get pretty raunchy back there. So they're walking through this area that's, you know, dark and filthy, and they've got a bathroom that's disgusting, and then the mirror is literally cracked and broken, like, you know, it's you know, somewhere in a crack house, and they've got a sign up top, you know, that's, "Are you looking your best?" And so the question is really, you know, what is that employee journey through their eyes? So, you know, you can talk the talk all you want, but when you're putting them into an environment, they're already starting out with the wrong tone, and, you know, everything you try to train really seems disingenuous. So there are a lot of positive ways to create that journey and make sure the whole end-to-end employee journey is developing the kind of employee that's going to really be, you know, that true brand ambassador and be able to cultivate these relationships with your guests.
And we recognize that it's that a lot of us are in very tough labor markets, and we force ourselves, or we force our managers to hire bodies as opposed to hire personalities. As Laura mentioned earlier, the interviewing process can almost become an audition rather than a mechanical interview. Let's not hire people and train them to be nice. Let's hire nice people. We've all heard that before. Once you realize, or once you establish that culture, it's so much easier to attract employees to your organization because the word gets around. You know it as well as we all know it, that your people are talking to each other, and they're also talking to other people within your industry. They're leaving and they're meeting up with other people who work in other establishments at a bar, and they're sitting around talking, and there's always somebody who says, "I love my job, I love my restaurant, I love my managers." Well, what is it about those people? They're the ones creating an employee experience first, and those employees will create the guest experience. This can become an entire webinar in itself, but they're all good points.
Well, thank you all again for your time today. Based on the comments and feedback we've gotten, after this tech webinar, we will be working on the employee journey. It sounds like there's a lot of interest for that, and we will be sending out copies of this webinar for your use, and I look forward to connecting with you again. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.